How's it going, Giants fans? My name is Alex with my co-host here, Anthony Rivardo, and today we want to discuss Collin Johnson. Specifically, look at some of his clips. We'll scatter them throughout the video for you guys if you're watching on YouTube. Interesting receiver, 6'6", one of the tallest receivers in football, if not the tallest. You look at Kenny Golladay, 6'4", has some really good size to him. Collin Johnson's even bigger, and he really showed out against the Patriots this past week on last Thursday in the preseason game. Finished with 7 receptions on 8 targets. So we'll discuss kind of what we think about him, if he can make this roster, what kind of role can he carve out on this team, especially because there's a lot of competition going on in the wide receiver position right now. So we'll kind of break that down a little bit, see who's in the lead there. But he's making a big impact on this team. Last year definitely filled in at some points, had a couple of decent outings, some nice catches, but this year he looks like he's elevated his game. Doing it in the preseason game is a little bit different than doing it in just a camp setting. So I think that was a really good indication he's improved. So that's a pretty good sign for the Giants if they're looking for another big body receiver who can kind of replicate that possession role. But Anthony, before we dive into Collin Johnson, what he's bringing to this team and what he's done so far this summer, how you do today, my friend?
I'm doing great, and I think Collin Johnson's a super interesting player for the Giants. He's starting to really ease into the Giants right now, starting to make a name for himself amongst Giants fans, amongst the coaching staff this summer. But I always thought that he was a decent player even last season. Here and there, he would get into the game during the regular season, make a couple nice catches. I think he's a pretty decent player, and he even seemed to have some decent chemistry with Daniel Jones last season. I know he was often compared to Kenny Golladay in terms of playing style. Golladay was signed to be the big body, number 1 X receiver for the Giants. Unfortunately, he hasn't really lived up to expectations, but they went ahead once Golladay was injured during the 2021 season, picked up Collin Johnson. He kind of filled in, and at times maybe even looked a little bit better than Kenny Golladay, which is kind of surprising to say, but I don't know if that's really saying as much about Golladay as it is about Collin Johnson, just being able to rise to the occasion in a very impressive fashion. So I think he's a pretty solid player. The Giants might have something a little bit special in Collin Johnson, in my opinion. And I think when you're taking a look at the status of the roster as we trim down here from 90 to 85, and then of course eventually down to 53, it's going to be really interesting to see who wins this battle in that backup wide receiver position. Right now, though, looks like Collin Johnson is running the race with the lead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the wide receiver kind of structure right now, you have Kenny Golladay as your top gun just based on his massive contract. He's the wide receiver 1 de facto to start the season. Then you go look at, Kadarius Toney, who if he starts off strong, I think he catapults into that wide receiver 1 role pretty quickly, but that's a big if he can stay healthy. Has been dealing with a leg injury, but did practice today. No limp, no nothing. I think they're just taking it easy, playing it cautious. They've been doing that with everybody this offseason, by the way. Brian Daboll's bringing over a much different approach toward mitigating injury and just managing injury and workload. And he's being a lot more cautious with the guys that have dealt with stuff in the past and have proven to be a little bit more sensitive to picking up nicks and knacks. So Kadarius Toney is back, and he's practicing, did some individual stuff today. Not a big deal. I think they're just doing some load management for him, making sure he's ready to go. I don't necessarily think he needs preseason gameplay. Like, what is 1 or 2 series going to really do for him? He already has been there for a year with Daniel Jones in that offense. He kind of understands exactly what his role is. He's not going to be a guy that just always finds himself downfield in big route concepts. I think that he's going to be more of your manufacturer. You're going to get him into good screen opportunities, get him into good short yardage opportunities where he gets into space and can make guys miss from there. So I think, taking care of those ankles and knees is a necessity. But after him, then you got Wan'Dale Robinson, who's healthy, has had a really, really strong summer. So I do like him a lot going to the season as a heavy, target share type of receiver for the Giants offense. And then, of course, you have Sterling Shepard, who's actually supposed to be ready for the regular season, having a really good summer, rehabilitating and making sure that he's ready to go. And then Darius Slayton, who we discussed yesterday, who we think could be on the trade block or the cut block in a couple days here. So we'll keep an eye on Darius Slayton and his kind of usage and how the Giants are starting to utilize him the last 2 preseason games of this offseason. But then you find yourself looking at Collin Johnson, Richie James, CJ Board, guys like that who have an opportunity to make the roster. Now, Richie James, I think, will make the roster because you can also utilize him on special teams. So right now I'm thinking Kenny Golladay, I'm thinking Kadarius Toney, Wan'Dale, Sterling Shepard. That's 4. Richie James is 5. And then you're looking at CJ Board, who also is a good gunner. So maybe he's on special teams. And maybe Collin Johnson's your 7th receiver if you're going to go with 7 receivers there. Guys like Alex Bachman, David Sills probably don't make the roster in this respect, but I think Collin Johnson probably sneaks on and gets that last slot. And he looks good, right? Like in the preseason game recently, 82 yards, 11.7 yards per catch on 8 targets, had a long of 17. He did have that one fumble, but his 6'6" frame is definitely something to be, about him specifically. Spent his rookie season with Jacksonville, played in 14 games, had 272 yards with 2 touchdowns and a 58% catch rate. And then last season, of course, made 12 appearances, but only had 21 targets for over 100, just about over 100 yards, no touchdowns. Not many receivers had touchdowns for the Giants last year. But, when you're looking at this position battle at the wide receiver spot, how likely do you think it is that Collin Johnson makes the roster? What does he have to do here to lock himself in? Because I think CJ Board and Richie James having that special teams utility definitely gives him a little bit of an edge.
Yeah, I think he just has to keep balling out, keep playing above the rest of the competition, keep being the best player that he can be. I think, it was a super impressive debut in the preseason against the Patriots for Collin Johnson. And if he's able to maintain that momentum and keep that level of play up throughout the rest of the preseason, then I think you're talking about him playing himself into a role on the roster. So I think really just the best thing for Collin Johnson, maybe get himself a touchdown in the preseason, go up there, moss somebody with his big frame, show what he's capable of that other people aren't capable of. Because yeah, CJ Board, he might have more special teams capabilities than Collin Johnson, but Collin Johnson has more big body jump ball capabilities than CJ Board. So he needs to prove that that's a much more important trait, or at least a much more usable trait for the Giants as they decide who they want on their roster. So for Collin Johnson, he just needs to separate himself from the pack. I know Richie James also has a special teams ability, and he's a really good underneath route runner. And I think that Richie James has been playing so well that he's almost locking himself into a roster spot at this point. But he also has a similar playing style to some of the starters on the Giants, Wan'Dale Robinson, Kadarius Toney, underneath route runners with some of after the catch ability, yards after the catch ability. That's kind of what Richie James is. So you could say that it's a little bit redundant there, but when you have Kenny Golladay as your only other 6'4" or higher or taller receiver on the roster, you kind of need a backup for him. That's why the Giants went ahead and got Collin Johnson last year. So they might have to just keep Collin Johnson on the roster this year to play the de facto Kenny Golladay role in case Kenny Golladay ends up getting injured once again. So I think it's very important for the Giants to keep that in mind. Kenny Galladay's health always being a factor. Kenny Galladay's inconsistent performances also becoming a major factor. And I think that's where Collin Johnson kind of steps in and separates himself from those special teams guys. Because yes, those special teams guys separate themselves from the rest of the wide receivers. But Collin Johnson being a 6'6" big body possession guy, he separates himself from the rest of the wide receivers with that trait. So he just needs to prove that that's the more important trait. And that's the trait that the Giants should select when they trim the roster.
Yeah, right. And you're looking at, like you said, Kenny Golladay. He's the perfect backup. If you have a guy like Kenny Golladay installed into the offense and you're planning to utilize him downfield, you want a guy like Collin Johnson behind him because he can closely resemble that quality. And he might even have a little bit more range given he's 6'6". So, he actually showed a little bit of speed. Honestly, you're going to see during the clips throughout this video, Collin Johnson's actually got some decent speed and he actually has some decent releases. He's not a bad player. I think sometimes it just takes guys a couple years to get their ground underneath of them. And, 2 years with Jacksonville, one with Jacksonville, one with the Giants last year, and maybe he's just finding his groove. So that's something to consider. He was drafted in the 5th round, 165th overall in 2020. Definitely has the size to be an effective receiver on this team. Now, the problem is, a lot of these guys are so injury prone. So I think the Giants have to really consider taking 7 receivers into the regular season, because can you trust Kadarius Toney? Not really right now. Can you trust Kenny Golladay? Not exactly. Sterling Shepard injured his whole career. You can't really trust him. I trust Wan'Dale. He hasn't had any injuries yet, knock on wood. I do think that there is a reason to believe that they should be holding on to as many receivers that understand the system and know the scheme as possible that can contribute. So I do think that Collin Johnson makes this roster, but he does have some good utility. The problem is he doesn't offer anything on special teams, so you're really just hoping that Richie James, CJ Board stay healthy. But then you could always put like David Sills, Alex Bachman on the practice squad. They don't really do anything on special teams either. So, can't really expect them to be useful unless you really, really need them. So interesting though, this is going to be a fun couple weeks here. We had some roster trimmings today. Jeremiah Hall been working with the first team tight end. He was released. There was another cornerback that was released, Gavin Heslop, corner, defensive back. He was also let go. And then Austin Prowl was put on injured reserve with an injury, obviously. So, they're starting to trim it down to, they're down to 85. We're getting really close. 53-man rosters coming up really quickly is going to be a lot of guys. We'll have you updated on any releasings, obviously, for this team moving forward, guys. But I hope you enjoyed this video discussing Collin Johnson. Definitely an interesting receiver that could make an impact this year. I am excited to see what he could do. Hopefully he makes the roster. That height and speed is definitely an interesting combination. But as always, make sure to like and subscribe below, and we'll catch you guys on the next Fireside Giants episode.